Welcome back to our Christmas stories. This is Christmas Every Day. The little girl came into her papa's study as she always did Saturday morning before breakfast and asked for a story. He tried to beg off that morning for he was very busy, but she wouldn't let him, so he began. Well, once there was a little pig. She put her hand over his mouth and stopped him at the word. She said she had heard little pig stories till she was sick of them. Well, what kind of story shall I tell then? About Christmas. It's getting to be the season. It's past Thanksgiving already. It seems to me, her papa argued, that I've told as often about Christmas as I have about the little pigs. No difference. Christmas is more interesting. Well, her papa roused himself from his writing by a great effort. Well, then I'll tell you about the little girl that wanted it Christmas every day in the year. How would you like that? First rate, said the little girl, and she nestled into his lap comfortably, ready for listening. Very well, then, this little pig. Ow! What are you pounding me for? Because you said little pig instead of little girl. I should like to know what's the difference between a little pig and a little girl that wants Christmas every day of the year. Papa, said the little girl warningly, if you don't go on, I'll give it to you. And at this, her papa immediately consented and darted into the story. Well, once there was a little girl who liked Christmas so much that she wanted it to be Christmas every day in the year. And as soon as Thanksgiving was over, she began to send postcards to the old Christmas fairy to ask him if she mightn't have it. But the old fairy never answered any of the postals, and after a while, the little girl found out that the fairy was very particular. The fairy wouldn't notice anything but letters, not even correspondence cards in envelopes, but real letters on sheets of paper and sealed outside with a monogram, or at least your initial. So then she began to send her letters, and in about 3 weeks, or just the day before Christmas, she got a letter from the fairy saying she could have Christmas every day of the year, and then they would see about having it even longer. The little girl was excited. She'd been preparing for the old-fashioned once-a-year Christmas that was coming the very next day, and perhaps the fairy's promise didn't quite make the impression as it would have some other time in the year. But she kept her resolve and said she'd keep it to herself, and then she would surprise everybody with it as it came true. And then, as happens with little girls, it slipped out of her mind altogether. She had a splendid Christmas. She went to bed early so as to let Santa have a chance at the stockings unhindered. And in the morning she was up the first of anybody, and she went and she felt them, and found hers all lumpy with packages of candy, oranges and grapes, pocketbooks and rubber balls, and all kinds of small presents. And her big brothers with nothing but tongs in them. He deserved that. And her young lady sister with a new silk umbrella. And her papa and mamas had potatoes and pieces of coal wrapped up in tissue paper, but they seemed to always get that on Christmas. Then she waited around till the rest of the family was up, and she was the first to burst into the library when the doors were open and look at the large presents that were laid out on the library table. Books, portfolios, boxes of stationery, breastpins and dolls and little stoves and dozens of handkerchiefs, inkstands and skates, snow shovels and photograph frames, little easels, boxes of watercolors, Turkish paste, nougat, candied cherries and dolls' houses, waterproofs, and the big Christmas tree lighted and standing in a wastebasket in the middle of it all. She had a splendid Christmas all day. She ate so much candy that she didn't want any breakfast. And the whole forenoon, the presents kept pouring in that the expressman had not had time to deliver the night before. And she went round giving the presents she had got for other people. And she came home and ate turkey and cranberry for dinner, and plum pudding and nuts and raisins and oranges and more candy. And then she went out and coasted and came in with a stomachache, crying. Her papa said he would see if his house was turned into that sort of fool's paradise another year. And then they had a light supper, and pretty early everybody went to bed. Here the little girl pounded her papa in the back again. "What now? Did I say pigs?" "You made them act like pigs," she said. "Well, didn't they?" "No matter. You oughtn't to put it into a story, though." "Very well, then. I'll take it all out." Her father went on. The little girl slept very heavily, and she slept very late. But she was wakened at last by the other children dancing round her bed with their stockings full of presents in their hands. "What is it?" said the little girl, and she rubbed her eyes and she tried to rise up in the bed. "Christmas! Christmas!" they all shouted and waved their stockings in her face. "Nonsense! It was Christmas yesterday." Her brothers and sisters just laughed. "We don't know about that, but it's Christmas today anyway. You come into the library and see." Then all at once it flashed on the little girl that the fairy was keeping her promise and her year of Christmases was about to begin. She was dreadfully sleepy, but she sprang up like a lark that had overeaten itself and gone to bed cross. And now she darted into the library. There it was again. Books, portfolios, boxes of stationery, and breastpins. "You needn't go over it all again, Papa. I can remember what was there last," said the little girl. Well, and there was the Christmas tree blazing away, and the family picking out presents, but looking pretty sleepy, and her father perfectly puzzled, and her mother was ready to cry. "I'm sure I don't see how I'm to dispose of all these things," said her mother. And her father said it seemed to him they had something just like it the day before, but he supposed he must have dreamed it. This struck the little girl as the best kind of joke, and so she ate so much candy she didn't want breakfast, and then she went around carrying presents and had turkey and cranberry for dinner, and then went out and coasted and came in with a "Papa!" The little girl thumped her father again. "What now?" "What did you promise, you forgetful thing?" Oh, yes, you're right." Well, the next day it was just the same thing over again, but everybody got even crosser. And at the end of a week's time, so many people had lost their tempers that you could pick up lost tempers anywhere. They perfectly strewed the ground. Even when people tried to recover their tempers, they usually got somebody else's, and it made the most dreadful mix. The little girl began to get frightened, keeping the secret all to herself. She wanted to tell her mother, but she didn't dare to. Her mother was upset. She was ashamed to ask the fairy to take back the gift. It seemed ungrateful and ill-bred, and she thought, maybe I'll just try to stand for it. But she hardly knew how she could, not for a whole year anyway. So it went on, and it was Christmas on St. Valentine's Day, and on Washington's birthday, just the same as every other day. And it didn't even skip the 1st of April, though everything was counterfeit that day, and that was some little relief at least. After a while, coal and potatoes began to be awfully scarce, so many had been wrapped up in tissue paper to fool papas and mamas with. Turkeys got to be $1,000 apiece. "Papa!" "What now?" "You're beginning to fib." "Well, 2,000 then." And they got to passing off almost anything for turkeys. Half-grown hummingbirds and even rocks out of the Arabian Nights. The real turkeys were so scarce. And cranberries. Well, they asked $1 apiece for cranberries. All the woods and orchards were cut down to become Christmas trees, and where the woods and orchards used to be, it looked like just a stubble field, with little stumps where the trees used to be. After a while, they had to make Christmas trees out of rags, and stuff them with bran like old-fashioned dolls. But there were plenty of rags, because people got so poor buying presents for one another that they couldn't get any new clothes, and they just wore their old ones to tatters. They got so poor that everybody had to go to the poorhouse, except for the confectioners and the fancy storekeepers and the picture booksellers, and maybe the expressmen too. They all got so rich and proud that they would hardly wait upon a person when he came by. It was perfectly shameful. Well, after it had gone on about 3 or 4 months, the little girl, whenever she came into the room in the morning and saw those great, ugly, lumpy stockings dangling at the fireplace and the disgusting presents around everywhere, she used to just sit down and burst out crying. In 6 months, She was exhausted. She couldn't even cry anymore. She just lay on the lounge and rolled her eyes and panted. About the beginning of October, she took to sitting down on dolls wherever she found them, French dolls or any kind. She hated the sight of them so. And by Thanksgiving, she was crazy and just slammed her presents across the room. By that time, people didn't carry presents around nicely anymore. They flung them over the fence or through the window or anything. And instead of running their tongues out and taking great pains to write, "For dear Papa or Mama or brother or sister or Susie or Sammy or Billy or Bobby or Jimmy or Jenny," or whoever it was, and troubling to get the spelling right, and then signing their names. Instead, they just wrote, "Take it, you horrible old thing." And then they would go and bang it against the front door. Nearly everybody had built barns to hold all their presents, but pretty soon the barns overflowed, and then they used to let them lie out in the rain or anywhere. Sometimes the police used to come and tell them to shovel their presents off the sidewalk, or they would arrest them. "I thought you said everybody had gone to the poorhouse," interrupted the little girl. "They did go at first," said her papa. "But after a while, the poorhouses got so full that they had to send people back to their own houses. They tried to cry when they got back, but they couldn't even make the least sound anymore." "Why couldn't they?" "Because they had lost their voices, saying Merry Christmas so much. Did I tell you how it was on the 4th of July? "No. How was it?" And the little girl now nestled into him closer, in expectation that something truly uncommon was about to take place. "Well, the night before, the boys stayed up to celebrate, as they always do, and then they fell asleep before 12 o'clock, as usual, expecting to be wakened by the bells and the cannon blasts, but it was nearly 8 o'clock before the first boy in the United States woke up, and then he found out what the trouble was. As soon as he could get his clothes on, he ran out of the house and smashed a big cannon torpedo down on the pavement. But it didn't make any noise, no more than a damp wad of paper. And after he tried about 20 or 30 more, he began to pick them up and look at them. Every single torpedo was a big raisin. Then he just streaked it upstairs and examined his firecrackers and toy pistols and $2 collection of fireworks, and found that they were nothing but sugar and candy painted up to look like fireworks. Before 10 o'clock, every boy in the United States found out that his 4th of July things had turned into Christmas things, and then they just sat down and cried. They were so mad. There are about 20 million boys in the United States, and so you can imagine what a noise they made. Some men got together before night with a little powder and thought that they might turn it purple and sugar yet. And they said they would fire off one cannon anyway. But the cannon burst into 1,000 pieces, for it was nothing but rock candy, and some of the men nearly got killed by the explosion of candy. The 4th of July orations all turned into Christmas carols when people tried to sing, and when anybody tried to read the Declaration, instead of saying, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary," he was sure to begin singing, "God rest you merry gentlemen." It was perfectly awful. The little girl drew a deep sigh. "How was it at Thanksgiving?" she asked. Her papa hesitated. "Well, I'm almost afraid to tell you. I'm afraid you'll think it's wicked." "Tell me anyway," said the little girl. Well, before it became Thanksgiving, it had leaked out who had caused all the Christmases. The little girl had suffered so much that she had started talking in her sleep, and after that, hardly anybody would play with her. People just perfectly despised her because of it now being known how greedy she had been and how it all came to happen. And now when it came Thanksgiving and she wanted them to go to church and have squash pie and turkey and show their gratitude, they said that all the turkeys had been eaten up for her, for all her Christmas dinners, and if she would stop the Christmases, then they might consider being grateful. Wasn't it dreadful? And the very next day, the little girl began to send letters to the Christmas fairy and then telegrams to stop it. But it didn't do any good. And then she got to calling at the fairy's house, but the girl that came to the door always said, "Not at home. Sorry, she's engaged. Nope, she's at dinner now." Or something along those lines anyway. And so it went on, till it came to the old once-a-year Christmas Eve. The little girl fell asleep, and when she woke up in the morning, she found it was all nothing but a dream. At least that's what the little girl in Daddy's lap thought. "No, indeed," said her papa. "It was all true. Every bit of it true." "Well, what did she find out then?" the little girl asked. "Why, that it was Christmas at last, and wasn't ever going to be any more. Now it's time for breakfast." The little girl held her papa fast around the neck. "No, you can't go, not if you're going to leave it that way." "Well, how do you want it left?" "Christmas, once a year." "All right," said her papa, and he went on again. Well, there was the great rejoicing all over the country, and it extended clear up into Canada. The people met together everywhere, and they kissed and cried for joy. The city carts went around and gathered up all the candy and raisins and nuts and dumped them into the river. And it made the fish perfectly sick. And the whole United States, as far out as Alaska, was one blaze of bonfires where the children were burning up their gift books and presents of all kinds. They had the greatest time. The little girl went to thank the old fairy because she had stopped its being Christmas. And she said she hoped she would keep her promise and see that Christmas never, never came again. Then the fairy frowned and asked her if she was sure she knew what she meant. And the little girl asked her, "Why not?" And the old fairy said that now she was behaving just as greedily as ever, and she'd better look out. This made the little girl think it all over carefully again, and she said she would be willing to have it Christmas about once in 1,000 years. And then she said 100. And then she thought about it and said 10. And at last she got down to 1. Then the fairy said that that was the good old way that had pleased people ever since Christmas began. And she agreed. Then the little girl said, "What are your shoes made of?" And the fairy said, "Leather." And the little girl said, "Bargain's done forever." And she skipped off and hippity-hopped the whole way home. She was so glad. "How will that do?" Papa asked. "First rate," said the little girl, but she hated to have the story stop, and she was rather sober. However, her mamma put her head in the door and asked her papa, "Are you ever coming to breakfast? What have you been telling that child?" "Oh, just a moral tale." The little girl caught him up around the neck again. "We know. Don't you tell what, Papa? Don't you dare tell what we talked about." This is our Christmas story for tonight. A story that's not just for tonight, but reminds us that perhaps having Christmas just one day a year is a little bit better than having Christmas every day a year. This was originally written by William Dean Howells. If you enjoyed this story, please stay tuned to listen to some more. Some of them are modern, some of them reach back like this one into the 1800s, but all of them are a joy for you to share with others. Please consider sharing this one with friends and family everywhere. I'm Motorcycle Pastor saying thanks for visiting tonight.